The storm last night had been cold. Cold and wild, with the kind of wind that finds its way through every crack and crevice of both old and new buildings, indiscriminate of every effort to prevent the cold from taking hold inside. That cold rested over the quaint river town of Ravens Bend, Maine. The Bend, as the locals called it, lay nestled beneath a blanket of heavy, wet snow, glowing in the blinding white of the morning sun. Mason Reed covered his eyes as he ducked out of the homeless shelter, hoisting his green, oversized duffel bag higher on his shoulder. Patrick Dupree, the unlucky worker whose duty it was to get everyone out, clapped him on the shoulder and gave him a knowing nod as if to say, "I'm sorry, you can't stay." Mason gave a curt nod in return and stepped out into the brisk, bright morning air. He could come back at dusk, which these days happened close to 4 in the afternoon, but for now, he had to find somewhere to duck away from the sharp, biting wind. The last vestiges of the nor'easter blew through the old mill town, dragging the cold air from the canal over the street and straight through Mason's old tattered jacket. He zipped it, covering his exposed face, and pushed into the wind as he made his way down the hard-packed sidewalk, already cleared by the intrepid city workers who braved the early morning sub-freezing temperatures to ready Ravens Bend for the day. The town was still asleep as he made his way down the hill towards the center of town and the river beyond. A few early risers were out walking their dogs or shoveling sidewalks, but most people remained bundled up in their homes, sipping coffee and enjoying a slow start to the day. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step taking him closer to Main Street and the businesses that lined either side. City Hall's tower loomed ahead and to the left, its face illuminated by spotlights. Even in this early sunlight, it was one of Mason's favorite places in town. He loved to sit on one of the benches ringing the nearby park and watch the world go by. But today, really, since the deep winter had set in, Mason had other plans. Get warm, stay warm. Those were his priorities for the day. He still had half a turkey sub a random stranger had given him yesterday. Mason was hoping to make it last for at least a few days. The wind picked up as he crossed the street, sending a chill through him that made him shiver involuntarily. His breath came out in frosty puffs that quickly dissipated in the air. He shoved his hands into his pockets and hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself as small as possible. He stared across the street at the brick archway leading to one of his favorite places in town. The black and white sign above the arch read Blind Date Books. The bookshop was one of his favorite places to go when he had extra cash on hand. It was always warm and smelled like coffee and old books. He could spend hours in there, looking at the different titles, flipping through the pages of whatever caught his eye. Before crossing the street, he spied a sandwich board in the archway that dropped his heart. Closed. Snow day. Turning back to the sidewalk, Mason continued down the main drag of town. The cold air numbed his face and hands despite his efforts to keep them tucked away. He knew he needed to find someplace warm soon or he wouldn't make it through the day. His stomach growled, reminding him of the half sandwich he had stashed away in the duffel. He considered eating it now, but decided against it. He may need it later. He walked past Donovan's Marvelous Mask, a small shop that had always had its door open and tinkling bells announcing its customers. It was one of those places that was always busy no matter what time of day it was. People were always coming and going, browsing the racks of colorful masks or chatting with the owner, Paul Delacroix. Mason missed Donovan, the previous owner who had died just last Halloween. He always had a job for Mason and never turned down his company. He wondered now if Paul had the same philosophy, but decided not to test his luck and pushed deeper into the town toward the falls. The river was always louder this time of year, the water rushing over the rocks as it made its way under the ice encrusting the falls. The sound was soothing despite the frigid temperatures. As he got closer, he could see the snow-covered rooftops of the buildings next to the falls. They were mostly abandoned now, but in their heyday they were part of a thriving mill town. He could imagine what it must have been like back then, with the mill operating day and night and the town bustling at the seams with people. Now most of the mills lay vacant except for businesses making use of the space for back-office workers and a few niche restaurants. Some said these buildings were haunted, but Mason was not one to believe in ghosts. He rounded the corner, and the falls came into view. The snow-covered rocks and icicles hanging from the edge of the waterfall sparkled in the sunlight. It was a beautiful sight, but one that did little to ease the chill he felt. He needed to find someplace to go, and soon. The old mill loomed ahead and to the right, its windows boarded and doors sealed shut. It had been abandoned for over half a century, but Mason knew there was a way in. He had found it by accident one day when he was exploring in the fall. The main entrance stood locked and barred, but he had found a loose board. near the back that led him into a small room that must have once been an office of some sort. Finding the loose board, he pulled it to the side, giving him just enough room to enter. He squeezed through the opening, making himself as small as possible. The mill was dark and musty, but still somehow familiar to him. He had walked through these halls countless times in his mind, imagining what it must have been like for someone who actually worked here day after day. The main room, once full of workers and the sounds of heavy machinery, was now empty. He could almost hear the rumble of machines, almost feel the vibrations under his feet. His heart pounded in his chest as he continued exploring every nook and cranny until he found himself standing in front of a set of stairs leading up to the upper level. Mason hesitated for only a moment before beginning his ascent. He had to see it, had to know what was at the top. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, but finally ended at a door with a small window near the top that let in just enough light from outside that he could make out a large open space beyond it. He took a deep breath, then slowly lifted his hand and grasped the knob, turning it ever so gently until he felt it give way beneath his touch. Holding his breath, Mason pushed open the door and stepped out onto the top floor of the mill. The view was breathtaking, overlooking all of town and even stretching to the river before disappearing into the thick forest beyond. Sighing contentedly, Mason sank down into a broken desk in front of the window, taking in everything he saw before him. Up here, the windows remained unbroken and very little of the wind made its way into the old office. Mason grew comfortable, almost forgetting that he was still in the middle of a deep freeze. As he gazed out over the town, he could feel time slowing down around him as if nothing else was real but this moment, this place, here in this mill. Everything seemed forgotten and at peace. It was just what Mason needed to relax finally and escape from the cold for a little while. That and a fire. He stood, dusting off his pants before walking to a small wood stove in the corner. It looked ancient, like a long-forgotten relic of days gone by, but there was still a decent amount of wood piled up next to it. He set about lighting a fire, using some old newspapers he found, and soon had a nice blaze going. The fire crackled and popped, wafting heat over Mason's face as he watched the flames dance and twine around each other, throwing shadows on the dusty walls of the mill. Sitting back down in front of the window, Mason warmed his hands and feet and watched as the sun rose higher, painting the sky in a crystal clear blue, only found in the sky of a Maine winter. He closed his eyes and slowly inhaled, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He didn't want to leave this place, didn't want to leave this moment, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. So instead he would linger for as long as he could, enjoying every minute of his fleeting respite from the harsh winter world outside the mill. The sound of a door opening below startled him, and he leapt to his feet, heart racing as he tried to think of a way to explain his presence if someone caught him. But as he heard footsteps coming up the stairs, he realized there was nowhere to hide. He would have to face whoever it was head-on. Mason steeled himself, heart still pounding in his chest as the footsteps grew closer and closer until they finally stopped just outside the door. He held his breath, not sure what to expect as the door slowly opened. An attractive young woman stepped into the room. She stood taller than Mason, slender, with dark shoulder-length hair and deep green eyes. Her narrow face, firm jaw, and high cheekbones cast stark shadows from the firelight. She wore a long red coat reaching down to her ankles. Her scruffy black boots softly sifted the dust as she entered the room. She looked around, her gaze darting around the room before landing on Mason. "Hello," she said, voice flowing and gentle like soft music. "I'm sorry if I startled you. I did not know I had company today." Mason let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and shook his head. It's okay," he said. I didn't know there was anyone here. If you claim this place, I can find somewhere else." The woman laughed softly. "Of course not," she said, walking towards him and settling down on the desk next to him. She looked out at the view, a soft smile playing on her lips as she gazed out over the town. "I'm Cora," she said, holding out her hand for Mason to shake. Mason nodded and took her hand in his, shaking it firmly. "I'm Mason." Cora smiled again and turned back toward the window, watching as the sun continued to rise higher in the sky. "It's beautiful here," she murmured almost to herself. "So peaceful." Mason nodded in agreement and watched as Cora leaned forward slightly, taking everything in before sighing contentedly and sinking into the ancient wooden chair. He felt drawn to this enigmatic woman, a strange warmth spreading through him as he watched her watching him with dark eyes full of life and mystery. I'm just staying the day. I won't get in your way, I promise. Once the shelter opens back up, I am back in there for the night, Mason said, leaning against the wall. Do you have somewhere warm to stay tonight? I have to stay here, Cora whispered, brushing her hand through the thick dust on the armrest of her chair. This is a thin place. If I'm not careful, the stories will bleed through. Mason frowned, not quite understanding. Stories? He asked. Yes, Cora said, looking back out at the view. Stories, tales, they get trapped here sometimes in places like this. Mason felt a chill run down his spine, and he shifted uncomfortably. Places like what? He asked. Cora laughed softly, the sound like tinkling glass. This place. She paused, drumming her fingers on the desk, and then continued. Places like this town have scars, deep scars. They carry a weight through generations. It's a deep magic that runs through places like this. She turned back to Mason, then her eyes piercing in the firelight. Do you believe in ghosts, Mason? She asked softly. Mason swallowed hard and shook his head. No, I don't. Cora nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I used to not believe in them, at least not until I came here. Then I learned the truth. What truth? Mason asked. He knew he should not engage, but he felt at ease with Cora. Ghosts don't exist, at least not how I used to think of them. Echoes remain. Echoes of the past, present, and future. Echoes of possibilities. That's what our stories are. We're giving voice to the echoes of the hidden stories of the universe. Mason frowned, still not quite understanding. Cora sighed, leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers in front of her. It's like this, she said. There's a place in this world that we can't see. It's a place of infinite potential and possibility. All the stories that have ever been, or will be, exist there. In that place, they are just echoes waiting to be given voice. And what is it that you do? You give voice to the echoes? Mason asked. Cora nodded. Yes, she whispered. I give voice to the echoes. She breathed deep of the chilly air. That's why I like this town. So many stories to tell. This place is a thin place. The stories come easier here. It's easier to find them, and once they're told, it keeps them from bleeding through. Bleeding through? What do you mean? The place our stories come from has been sick for a long time. In the thin places, if the stories aren't given voice, then they can become real, especially on nights like last night. The storm gave the echoes more power. They aren't malicious or evil, but they can give life to malicious entities and cause harm to the real world. That's absurd, Mason chuckled. Is that true of all stories? He raised an eyebrow at Cora as he waited for an answer. What happened last night? I think I would have heard if something went down in town last night. Cora laughed, a hint of the crystal wind chime tinkled beneath her voice. Mason, last night many stories came through, but most folks ignore them, preferring to believe something more in line with how they choose to perceive reality. Maybe by telling them to you now, I can take any remaining power away from them. Would you be willing to listen for a bit? Humor an old woman. Sure, Mason nodded. It's not like he had anywhere else to be. Tend your fire. I'll tell you all that transpired last night, and when I'm finished, you can tell me if you believe me. Mason stoked the fire, his curiosity piqued by Cora's words. He settled back in his chair, preparing to listen to her tale. Cora spoke, her voice soft and melodic. As I said, this town is built on scars. Scars of violence and trauma running deep through the psyche of Raven's Bend. There are stories that react to that kind of trauma, and last night, they came bubbling to the surface. I could hear them in the wind, see them in the shadows. Screaming faces caught in mid-air, tumbling over end, down an invisible staircase, a woman wailing for her husband, her mouth opened in a silent gasp of grief, a pale man hungry and staring into the whiteout of the blizzard. Cora paused, her eyes distant, remembering what she saw last night. It was horrible, but also beautiful, she whispered finally. And now, by sharing with you, maybe some peace will come to these stories. So tell me then, what happened last night? Mason said with a skeptical tone to his voice. Cora nodded and continued, her voice growing stronger as she fell into a trance-like state. As she spoke, Mason found himself drawn in by the words, caught up in the ebb and flow of Cora's storytelling. Images formed and danced within his vision, and he felt the tempestuous energy of the storm thrumming around him as she gave voice to the tales from the previous night. "It began," she said, "like all things do, on nights like last night. It all began before the storm. Early in the afternoon at the Big Apple on Main Street, in fact. As Daisy Merrow pumped gas into her car, she gazed into the distance. On the horizon stood the dark omens of the coming nor'easter.